At my husband's funeral, my brother-in-law looked me in the eye and told everyone I was only pretending to grieve because I could smell the money. For a moment, the entire funeral home went so silent I could hear the soft hum of the lights above us and the rain tapping against the stained glass windows. I was standing beside Daniel's framed photograph, my hand resting near the white roses I had chosen because they were the same flowers he brought me on our first anniversary. I had barely slept in 4 days. My black dress felt too tight around my chest, not because of the fabric, but because every breath hurt. Daniel Carter had been my husband for 11 years, my best friend for 15, and the only person in that room who had ever made me feel like I truly belonged in his family. Now he was gone, and before I could even understand the shape of that loss, his older brother Mark decided to turn my grief into a public trial. He stepped close enough that I could smell the expensive cologne he always wore to family events, the kind he thought made him seem successful. His voice was low at first, but loud enough for the front row to hear. "You can stop acting now, Emily," he said. "Daniel isn't here to protect you anymore. We all know what you were waiting for." I looked at him, confused, hoping in some foolish part of me that grief had made me mishear him. But Mark raised his chin and turned slightly toward the room, making sure his mother, his cousins, Daniel's business partners, and half the people from town could see him standing there like a man announcing a verdict. "She wants the money," he said. "That's what this has always been about." A small gasp moved through the room. Daniel's mother, Margaret, did not defend me. She sat frozen in the front pew with a tissue clenched in her hand, her face pale, her eyes refusing to meet mine. I waited for someone to say Mark had gone too far. I waited for one person to remember how many nights I had sat beside Daniel during his long hospital stays, how many mornings I had driven him to appointments before sunrise, how many times I had quietly held our life together while he tried to keep his company from falling apart. But no one spoke. Mark took my silence as permission to continue. He said I had isolated Daniel. He said I had filled his head with ideas about cutting out his own family. He said a woman who married into the Carter name had no right to act like she was born to it. Every sentence landed in front of strangers, friends, and relatives like stones dropped onto glass. My face burned, but I did not cry. Not then. I looked down at my wedding ring, the same simple gold band Daniel had bought when we were still renting a 2-bedroom apartment outside Columbus and counting every dollar before payday. Back then, there was no family estate, no trust, no company accounts people whispered about in corners. There was just Daniel making pasta in a tiny kitchen and promising me that one day, if life ever became complicated, we would still choose each other first. Mark leaned closer and said, "After today, you will not touch a cent that belongs to this family." I wanted to tell him that Daniel was not a bank account to me. I wanted to tell him that I would have traded every house, every share, every dollar for 5 more minutes of Daniel laughing at our kitchen table. But something in Mark's eyes stopped me. It was not grief. It was confidence. He was not losing control. He believed he was taking it. So I did the only thing I could do without breaking in front of everyone. I lifted my hand from Daniel's photograph, turned away from Mark, and walked past the rows of silent faces toward the back of the funeral home. Behind me, I heard whispers rise like smoke. By the time I reached the door, I understood something Daniel had tried to warn me about in the final weeks of his life. His death had not ended the family's secrets. It had opened the door to all of them. The first thing I noticed when I stepped outside was how cold the air felt compared to the room I had just left. It was early November in Ohio, the kind of gray afternoon where the sky looked heavy enough to press down on the rooftops, and the parking lot of the funeral home was slick with rain. I stood beneath the awning for a few seconds, trying to breathe without shaking. Behind the glass doors, I could still see people turning their heads, whispering, pretending not to look at me while looking at nothing else. I had walked out before Mark could make me cry in front of them, but that did not mean his words had missed their mark. They followed me like a stain. I was only a few steps from my car when Margaret came out after me. Daniel's mother had always carried herself like a woman who believed emotion should be folded neatly and kept out of sight. Even that day, with her oldest black coat buttoned to her throat and her silver hair pinned perfectly behind her ears, she looked less broken than disappointed. For one brief second, I thought she had come to apologize. I thought grief had frozen her in the chapel, and now, away from Mark's audience, she would remember that I had loved her son. Instead, she stopped an arm's length away and said, "Emily, I think it would be best if you did not come back to the house tonight." The words were soft, but they landed harder than Mark's accusation. "The house?" I asked, because I could not make my mind accept what she meant. "My house." Margaret looked past me toward the wet pavement. "Daniel's house," she corrected. "The Carter house." I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence to change it into something less cruel. She said everyone was too emotional, that tensions were high, that Mark was only trying to protect what Daniel had built. She said the family needed time to sort through legal matters without confusion. Confusion. That was the word she used for 11 years of marriage, for the home where I had cooked Daniel soup when his treatments made food taste like metal, for the bedroom where his slippers were still beside the closet door because I had not been strong enough to move them. I asked her where she expected me to go. She hesitated, then said there was a motel near the interstate, one Daniel's company sometimes used for visiting contractors. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the distance between who I had been that morning and who they had decided I was by afternoon seemed impossible. Before I could answer, Mark appeared behind her with Daniel's cousin Peter and 2 men from the family business. Mark held my small black purse and the wool coat I had left inside. He handed them to me like a manager removing a customer from a restaurant. "This is not personal," he said, though his eyes told me it was. "Until the estate is reviewed, you should not have access to documents, accounts, or property connected to Daniel." I told him my clothes were in that house. My medicine was in that house. Daniel's wedding ring, the letters he wrote me, the photo albums from our life together, all of it was there. Mark gave a thin smile and said they would pack a few essentials and send them later. Margaret did not look at me. That was the moment I understood she had chosen a side, not because she knew the truth, but because Mark had offered her a version of grief that came with someone to blame. I drove away from the funeral home with no music playing, both hands tight on the steering wheel, my wedding ring catching the pale light every time I passed under a street lamp. I did not go to the motel. I went to the small storage unit Daniel and I had rented years earlier when we downsized his old office, because it was the only place Mark would not think to search first. In the back, beneath a plastic bin of Christmas ornaments and a folded camping chair we had used only once, I found the cedar box Daniel always said was full of boring paperwork. My name was written on a cream-colored envelope taped to the lid. Not Mrs. Carter. Not Emily Carter. Just Emily, in Daniel's careful handwriting. My fingers went numb before I even opened it, because suddenly I remembered what he had whispered 3 weeks before he passed, when he squeezed my hand and told me, "If Mark turns everyone against you, do not fight him in the hallway. Let the papers speak where it matters." Inside the cedar box, there was not a fortune, not a deed, not the kind of dramatic proof people imagine when secrets finally surface. There was a folded letter, a flash drive, a copy of Daniel's old company identification badge, and a business card for Rebecca Sloan, an attorney I had met only twice in my life. The letter was short, written in Daniel's steady hand, but every line felt like it had been waiting for me long before I understood why. He told me not to call Mark. He told me not to answer questions from anyone in the Carter family unless Rebecca was present. He told me that if I was reading those words after his funeral, then Mark had probably moved faster than expected. I sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit with the rain ticking against the metal door, reading that sentence again and again until the cold started to creep through my dress. Daniel had known. He had known his brother would not wait, would not mourn, would not even let the flowers wilt before trying to take control of the story. My phone buzzed before I could finish the second page. It was a message from Margaret, formal and distant, telling me Mark had arranged for a few of my personal belongings to be placed in boxes and delivered the next morning. She wrote that it would be better for everyone if I did not come to the house in person. A minute later, another message came from Peter, Daniel's cousin, saying he hoped I would do the right thing and let the family handle Daniel's affairs. Then came one from a woman at Daniel's company, someone I had invited to Thanksgiving twice, saying she was sorry for my loss but asking whether I had any company documents in my possession. By 9 o'clock that night, Mark had already made himself the voice of Daniel's memory. He had called relatives in Cleveland, partners in Columbus, even the retired accountant Daniel trusted for 20 years. He told them I was unstable. He said I had stormed out of the funeral because I could not answer simple questions about the estate. He said Daniel had been under pressure before he died, and that certain decisions needed to be reviewed before anyone allowed me near the money. The cruelest part was how reasonable he made it sound. Mark did not shout in those calls. He did not curse my name. He used words like protection, responsibility, transparency, and family legacy. He painted himself as the grieving older brother forced into an uncomfortable duty, while I became the suspicious widow hiding in the shadows. With papers I had no right to touch. The next morning, 2 cardboard boxes arrived at the motel room I had finally checked into after midnight. They were left at the front desk, taped neatly, my name written in black marker. Inside were 3 sweaters, a pair of jeans, my toothbrush, 1 framed photograph of Daniel and me from a vacation in Maine, and a stack of mail that was not even all mine. They had not packed my winter coat. They had not packed Daniel's letters. They had not packed the blue mug he used every morning or the blanket from our couch or the small wooden box where he kept ticket stubs from our anniversary trips. It was not an accident. It was a message. They were reducing my life with Daniel to a visitor's bag. By noon, Mark had gone further. He sent an email through his attorney, claiming that for the protection of the estate, I needed to turn over all keys, passwords, records, and devices connected to Daniel or Carter Holdings. The email said failure to cooperate could be interpreted as obstruction. I read that word 3 times and felt a strange calm settle over me. Obstruction sounded official. It sounded frightening. It sounded like exactly the kind of word Mark would use on a woman he expected to panic. But Daniel's letter was still beside me on the motel bed, and Rebecca Sloane's business card was in my hand. I called her office with my thumb trembling over the screen. When her assistant answered, I gave my name, and before I could explain anything, the woman said, "Mrs. Carter, Ms. Sloane has been expecting your call." That was when I realized the fight Mark thought he had started at the funeral had actually begun long before Daniel died. Rebecca Sloane's office was on the 23rd floor of a glass building in downtown Columbus, the kind of place Daniel used to say made every problem feel more expensive the moment you walked through the door. I arrived wearing the same black dress from the funeral because most of my clothes were still locked inside the house Mark now treated like his private office. The receptionist offered me coffee, but my stomach was too tight to accept it. 5 minutes later, Rebecca opened her door herself. She was in her early 50s, calm in a way that did not feel cold, with silver blonde hair cut just above her shoulders and a stack of folders already waiting on her conference table. She did not give me a speech about how sorry she was. She simply touched my hand for 1 second and said, "Daniel loved you very much, Emily. That is why we need to be careful now." I placed the cedar box on the table and showed her the letter, the flash drive, and the old identification badge. Rebecca read the first page without changing expression, but when she saw the second page, her mouth tightened slightly. "He told you about Mark," she said. It was not a question. I shook my head. "Not really. He said there were things I did not need to carry unless the time came." Rebecca leaned back and looked toward the window, where the city below moved like nothing in my world had collapsed. Then she explained that Daniel had come to her almost 2 years earlier, after discovering irregular transfers inside Carter Holdings. At first, he thought it was sloppy accounting, maybe a vendor mistake or an old authorization that had never been closed. But the more he looked, the more the pattern pointed toward someone with family access, someone who knew which accounts would not be watched every week. Daniel did not accuse Mark publicly because Margaret's health had been fragile that year, and because Daniel believed one direct confrontation would make Mark hide whatever trail remained. Instead, he quietly began moving the most important assets into a trust structure that required independent oversight. I listened without speaking, feeling each word connect to moments I had not understood at the time. Daniel working late at the kitchen table, closing his laptop when Mark called, asking me twice whether I trusted Rebecca, making me promise never to sign legal papers in a hurry. Rebecca opened one folder and slid a document toward me. My name appeared halfway down the page, but not in the way Mark had claimed. I was not listed as someone grabbing Daniel's money. I was listed as Daniel's designated protector for his personal interest in the trust, with limited authority until a probate judge confirmed the terms. There were 2 independent trustees, 1 financial auditor, and 1 clause that made my throat close when Rebecca read it aloud. If Daniel became incapacitated or passed away, Mark Carter was to have no unilateral control over trust assets, company voting shares, or family property connected to Daniel's estate. Daniel had written that clause himself. He knew Mark would say I manipulated him, I whispered. Rebecca nodded. He knew Mark would say many things. That is why he left records, not arguments. Then she asked for the flash drive. I watched her insert it into a secure laptop that was not connected to the office network. A folder opened with dates, scanned bank notices, emails, and voice notes Daniel had made for himself. 1 audio file was labeled with Mark's name and a date from last spring. Rebecca did not play it. Not yet. She only copied the contents to an encrypted drive and said, from this point forward, silence is your strongest protection. Mark expects you to defend yourself emotionally. We are going to let him speak until his own words become part of the record. That afternoon, while I was still sitting in Rebecca's office, Mark sent another email demanding that I appear at the Carter house the next morning to sign a temporary cooperation agreement. Attached was a document giving him access to Daniel's personal files, company passwords, and financial communications. At the bottom, in bold letters, it said refusal could harm my standing with the family and the court. For the first time since the funeral, I almost smiled. Mark thought he was cornering a grieving widow with legal language. He did not know Daniel had built the corner for him. The next morning, I did not go to the Carter house. Rebecca sent Mark's attorney a formal response before 8 o'clock, stating that I would not sign any document without full disclosure, independent review, and court supervision. The email was polite, clean, and impossible to twist into panic. Mark called me 17 minutes later. I watched his name flash across my phone while sitting in the motel breakfast room beside a paper cup of coffee I had not touched. A television mounted in the corner played local weather, warning about colder rain moving through central Ohio by evening, and an older couple near the waffle machine laughed softly about something ordinary. Their normal morning made mine feel even stranger. I let Mark's call go to voicemail, exactly as Rebecca had instructed. Then I let the next one go. Then the next. By noon, he had left 3 messages, each one more controlled than the last, but the control was thin. In the first, he said I was making a painful situation harder than it needed to be. In the second, he said Margaret was devastated by my behavior. In the third, he said people were starting to ask what I was hiding. I saved every message and forwarded them to Rebecca. She answered with only one sentence, "Do not reply." Silence, I was learning, was not weakness when someone else needed your reaction to build their lie. Mark had expected me to show up crying, angry, desperate to defend myself in the living room where Daniel and I had hosted Christmas dinner 2 years earlier. He wanted witnesses. He wanted me emotional. He wanted one sentence he could repeat later as proof that I was unstable. When I did not give him that, he created a new performance. That afternoon, Margaret sent a group message to several relatives saying the family was heartbroken that I had refused to cooperate with a peaceful review of Daniel's affairs. She wrote that Mark was only trying to honor Daniel's legacy and protect everyone from confusion. I stared at the message for a long time, not because the words surprised me, but because I could hear Mark inside them. Margaret had never used phrases like peaceful review or protect everyone from confusion. Those were his words dressed in her grief. Peter texted me privately after that, saying maybe I should think about how this looked. He said if I had nothing to hide, signing a temporary agreement should not bother me. I wanted to ask him whether he had read the agreement, whether he knew it gave Mark access to accounts Daniel had specifically protected from him, whether he understood that a family name could be used like a lock on a door. Instead, I sent nothing. I drove to a small diner near the edge of town, where Daniel and I used to stop after appointments when he was tired but still wanted blueberry pancakes. I sat in a booth by the window and opened the copy of his letter again. There was a line I had missed the night before because my eyes had been blurred with exhaustion. Daniel had written, "Mark will move quickly because speed makes people mistake pressure for truth." I read that sentence until I could hear Daniel's voice behind it. He had never been a dramatic man. If he wrote something down, he meant it. By late afternoon, Mark changed tactics again. His attorney filed an emergency petition claiming that Daniel's estate was at risk because I had possession of unknown records and refused family access. Rebecca called me just after 5 o'clock. Her voice remained steady, but I could hear papers moving on her desk. "This is good," she said. I almost thought I had misheard her. "Good?" I asked. She explained that Mark had just brought the matter into probate court himself, which meant his claims now had to be supported with evidence under a judge's supervision. He had chosen the stage because he thought it would frighten me. He did not understand it was the only room where Daniel's papers could finally speak. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday at the Franklin County Courthouse. Rebecca told me to bring the cedar box, wear something simple, and prepare myself for Mark to look confident. "He will try to make you feel alone," she said. "But he is walking into a record Daniel prepared for 2 years." That night, the motel room felt smaller than ever. The heater clicked on and off beneath the window, and rain slid down the glass in crooked lines. I laid Daniel's photograph on the nightstand beside my wedding ring, not because I was taking it off forever, but because my finger had swollen from gripping it too often. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to cry quietly, not for the money, not for the house, not for the family that had turned its back on me, but for the man who had loved me enough to know that one day, when everyone else demanded my voice, the truth would need my silence. Monday morning arrived with a hard frost on the motel windows and a sky the color of wet concrete. I woke before my alarm, not because I had slept enough, but because my body seemed to understand that the day Mark had been building toward was finally here. I wore a navy dress Rebecca had helped me buy from a department store the day before, simple enough that no one could say I was performing grief, but formal enough that I would not look like the broken woman Mark wanted the court to see. I placed Daniel's letter, the flash drive, and the copy of the trust documents inside a plain leather folder, then sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with my hands folded over it. The motel room smelled faintly of coffee from the lobby and laundry detergent from the sheets. It was not home. It was not even close. But it was quiet, and quiet had become the only place where I could still hear Daniel clearly. Rebecca picked me up at 8:15. She did not ask if I was ready, because we both knew readiness had nothing to do with it. On the drive to the Franklin County Courthouse, she reviewed what would happen in a calm voice. Mark's attorney would speak first. They would likely describe me as uncooperative, emotional, and potentially harmful to the estate. Rebecca would not object to every insult. She would let the judge hear how much Mark was assuming before she showed what Daniel had actually signed. "Remember," she said as we pulled into the courthouse parking garage, "he wants a reaction. Give him a record instead." The courthouse was busier than I expected, filled with people carrying folders, wearing winter coats, checking phones, whispering in corners. It struck me as strange that for everyone else, this was simply Monday. For me, it felt like walking into the room where my marriage would either be reduced to a money dispute or defended by the last careful choices my husband had made. Mark was already there when we entered the probate courtroom. He stood near the front with his attorney, wearing a charcoal suit and the expression of a man who had practiced looking wounded in a mirror. Margaret sat behind him with Peter and 2 cousins, all of them grouped together as if grief had assigned seating. When Margaret saw me, her eyes dropped to the folder in my hands, then quickly moved away. Mark looked directly at me and gave a small nod, almost sympathetic, as though we were 2 reasonable adults meeting to settle an unfortunate misunderstanding. That was his gift. He could make cruelty look like responsibility if the room was formal enough. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Judge Helen Whitmore was a woman in her 60s with clear eyes and a voice that made the room settle before she even finished her first sentence. She explained that the hearing concerned an emergency petition related to the estate of Daniel Carter and the preservation of certain assets pending probate review. Mark's attorney stood and began exactly as Rebecca predicted. He said Daniel's passing had created a difficult period for the Carter family. He said Emily Carter had removed unknown documents from a private storage unit. He said she had refused reasonable requests for cooperation. He said there were serious concerns that Daniel, in his final months, may have been influenced against his own relatives. Each word was chosen to sound careful, but I could feel what sat underneath them. Gold digger. Outsider. Liar. Mark kept his eyes on the judge, but I noticed the faint lift of his mouth whenever his attorney said family legacy. Then Rebecca stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend my character with emotion. She simply said Daniel Carter had anticipated a dispute over control, and that the court should review the documents he executed long before his final illness. Mark's attorney objected, saying there was no proof those documents were relevant to the emergency petition. Judge Whitmore looked over her glasses and asked, if this petition is about who should control the estate, why would Mr. Carter's own control documents not be relevant? The courtroom went still. For the first time since the funeral, Mark stopped looking confident. Rebecca opened her folder, and the sound of paper sliding across the table seemed louder than it should have been. She handed the first document to the clerk, then turned slightly toward me, not smiling, not celebrating, just steady. In that moment, I understood what Daniel had meant. We were not there to prove I loved him. We were there to let the truth show who had been waiting for the money all along. Rebecca's first document was the trust certification Daniel had signed 22 months before he died, and as the clerk passed copies to both attorneys, I watched Mark's face change in a way most people in the room might have missed. It was only a flicker, a quick tightening around his eyes, but I had seen Daniel make that same expression when he realized a business number did not add up. Mark had expected old grief, messy emotions, maybe a widow with a folder full of personal letters. He had not expected a document filed, witnessed, notarized, and dated long before any hospital bed or final goodbye could be used to question Daniel's judgment. Rebecca asked the court to note that the trust had been created while Daniel was actively managing Carter Holdings, attending board meetings, signing quarterly reports, and traveling between Columbus and Cincinnati for supplier negotiations. She did not say Mark was lying. She did something worse for him. She made his version sound impossible without ever raising her voice. Mark's attorney stood quickly and argued that the existence of a trust did not prove I should have any control over family property. Judge Whitmore nodded, then asked Rebecca to identify the relevant provisions. Rebecca turned one page, then another, and began reading in a steady voice. Daniel had placed his personal shares, several investment accounts, and the deed interest in the Carter house under independent oversight. The trust required 2 trustees to approve ordinary financial decisions, but any change involving company voting rights, sale of real estate, or transfer of Daniel's personal assets required my written consent after court confirmation. I felt the room shift before anyone spoke. Behind Mark, Peter leaned toward Margaret, and Margaret lifted one hand to her mouth. For days, they had been told I was trying to seize Daniel's money. Now the court was hearing that Daniel had given me a blocking position because he wanted someone outside the Carter family pressure circle to stop reckless decisions. Mark's attorney tried to interrupt again, saying Daniel may not have fully understood the consequences. Rebecca was ready. She handed over a physician's letter from the year the trust was created, confirming Daniel was in good cognitive health at the time. Then she presented meeting notes from Carter Holdings showing Daniel had chaired 2 financial reviews the same week he signed the trust update. Judge Whitmore looked at the dates, then looked at Mark's side of the table. Counsel, she said, your petition suggests Mrs. Carter may have influenced her husband during a period of decline. These documents appear to predate that period by a significant margin. Mark shifted in his chair. His attorney said they had concerns about why Daniel would exclude his own brother from control. Rebecca paused, and in that pause, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Your Honor," she said, "we can address that directly." She opened another folder, thinner than the first, and removed a set of account summaries. She asked permission to question Mark briefly about the basis of his emergency petition. Judge Whitmore allowed it. Mark stood and walked to the front with the careful posture of a man determined not to look worried. Rebecca began gently, almost politely. She asked whether he had told relatives that I was hiding Daniel's documents. Mark said yes, because he believed it was true. She asked whether he had requested access to Daniel's passwords and business communications. He said yes, for the protection of the estate. She asked whether he had represented himself as the appropriate person to oversee Daniel's interest in Carter Holdings. He said yes again, his voice gaining confidence, as if each answer was helping him regain the room. Then Rebecca lifted one page from the account summaries and asked the question that changed the air completely. "Mr. Carter, if you did not have control over Daniel's assets, why does your electronic authorization appear on 3 transfers from an account connected to his shareholder distribution 6 months before his death?" Mark blinked once. The room went still. His attorney turned toward him sharply, but Mark did not answer right away. Rebecca did not rush him. She let the silence stretch long enough for everyone behind him to feel it. Finally, Mark said he would need to review the documents. Rebecca nodded and placed a second page beside the first. "Of course," she said. "And while you do, please also review the email in which Daniel asked you to explain those same transfers, and the message you sent back saying, 'Do not drag Emily into this.'" Margaret made a small sound behind him, not loud, not dramatic, but full of recognition. Mark's face had gone pale. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, nobody in that room was looking at me like I was the problem. Mark's attorney asked for a recess, but Judge Whitmore did not grant one immediately. She looked at the account summaries, then at the email Rebecca had placed into evidence, and her expression did not change, which somehow made the silence feel even heavier. Mark stood at the front of the courtroom with one hand resting on the edge of the table, as if the polished wood could keep him steady. Rebecca did not look triumphant. That was what made her so effective. She looked like a woman following a map Daniel had drawn carefully, step by step, before anyone else knew there was a storm coming. When the judge finally allowed Mark to return to his seat, his confidence had thinned into something brittle. His attorney whispered to him, but Mark kept his eyes down. Rebecca then asked the court to review the full trust structure, not just the portion naming me. She explained that Daniel had not handed me a blank check, and he had not cut out his family out of bitterness. He had built a safeguard. The trust named 2 independent trustees, a certified public accountant named Alan Mercer and a retired bank officer named Patricia Doyle, both with decades of experience and no family relationship to the Carters. It also required annual reporting to the probate court if any dispute arose after Daniel's death. My role was narrower but powerful in one specific way. I could not sell company shares by myself. I could not empty accounts. I could not move property into my own name. But I could stop anyone else from doing those things without review. Daniel had not made me the owner of everyone's future. He had made me the locked door Mark could not open alone. Rebecca read the clause slowly, and every word seemed to strip away the story Mark had spent days spreading. He had told everyone I was chasing money, yet the document showed Daniel had designed the trust to prevent one person from grabbing control. Then Rebecca presented the court with the flash drive inventory. She did not play the audio yet, but she described the files, emails from Daniel requesting explanations for missing shareholder distributions, scanned copies of bank notices showing transfers routed through a consulting account Mark had access to, and a timeline Daniel had prepared after noticing repeated withdrawals in amount small enough to avoid immediate board attention but large enough to matter over time. One transfer was for $12,900. Another was for $18,400. A third was just under $25,000. They were not dramatic numbers compared to the value of Carter Holdings, but that made them worse. They looked calculated. They looked like someone testing how much could move before anyone asked why. Mark's attorney objected, saying the hearing was not about allegations against Mark. Judge Whitmore answered that Mark had asked the court to decide whether I was a risk to the estate, and evidence about his own financial access was relevant if he was presenting himself as the safer alternative. Margaret lowered her head. Peter no longer sat close to Mark. Even from across the room, I could see the family rearranging itself emotionally, inch by inch, as if the truth had quietly changed the seating chart. Rebecca then handed over Daniel's written memorandum, dated 14 months before his death. In it, Daniel wrote that he loved his mother, cared about the family company, and wanted no public scandal if it could be avoided. But he also wrote that Mark had shown a pattern of entitlement toward assets he did not personally earn and pressure toward relatives he believed he could control. Daniel's final line in that memo broke something open in me. Rebecca read it aloud in the same steady voice. Emily is not to be treated as an outsider to my life simply because she is the only person in this family who never asked me what she would receive when I was gone. The courtroom blurred for a second, but I did not look away. Mark had made me stand alone at Daniel's funeral while he called my grief an act. Now Daniel's own words were standing in the room for me. Judge Whitmore ordered the trust documents accepted for review, denied Mark immediate control over Daniel's estate materials, and directed both sides to preserve all financial records. She also stated that any further attempt to pressure me into signing private agreements outside counsel could weigh against Mark's position. It was not the final ruling yet, but the power in the room had shifted. Mark walked in that morning believing the court would force me to hand him Daniel's keys. Instead, the court had found the lock Daniel left behind, and Mark's fingerprints were already on the wrong side of it. The hearing did not end with applause, or shouting, or the kind of dramatic collapse people imagine when the truth finally enters a room. It ended with Judge Whitmore reading her order in a calm voice while everyone listened because there was nothing left to interrupt. Mark's emergency petition was denied. He would not receive access to Daniel's passwords, personal records, company communications, or trust materials. The independent trustees would remain in place. Rebecca would submit Daniel's full documentation for probate review, and any financial movement connected to the disputed accounts would be preserved for examination. Then Judge Whitmore looked directly at Mark and said that private pressure against a surviving spouse, especially after counsel had been retained, would not be viewed favorably by the court. Mark nodded once, stiffly, but he did not look at me. That was how I knew the morning had changed him. At the funeral, he had wanted every eye on us because he believed shame was a tool he could control. In court, he wanted the floor to open and swallow the record whole. When the judge dismissed the hearing, people stood slowly, gathering coats, folders, and the pieces of certainty they had brought in with them. Margaret remained seated. Her tissue was twisted so tightly between her fingers that it had started to tear. Peter walked out without speaking to Mark. One of Daniel's cousins touched my shoulder gently as she passed, then seemed embarrassed by the gesture and moved quickly toward the door. Mark's attorney kept his voice low while speaking to him, but Mark was no longer performing grief. He looked smaller without the story he had built around himself. I followed Rebecca into the hallway, where the courthouse noise returned all at once: footsteps, elevator bells, distant conversations, the shuffle of paper. I thought I would feel victorious, but victory was not the word for it. I felt tired. I felt sad. I felt like Daniel had reached across the distance between life and death just long enough to pull my name out of the dirt. Margaret came toward me near the windows overlooking the street. For a moment, I saw the woman who had taught me how Daniel liked his coffee at Christmas, the woman who once mailed me a handwritten recipe for apple pie because she said every Carter kitchen needed one. Her eyes were wet now, and her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. She said, "Emily, I did not know." I wanted to answer kindly. I wanted to say it was all right, because that is what people expect widows to say when everyone else finally feels guilty. But it was not all right. She had let Mark call my love an act. She had sent me out of my own home with 2 boxes and no winter coat. She had chosen the easier lie because it came from her son. So I said the only honest thing I could. "You did not know because you did not ask me." Her face crumpled, but I did not stay to repair what she had broken. Rebecca walked with me to the parking garage, and outside, the frost had melted into thin streams of water along the curb. The city looked ordinary again, buses moving, office workers crossing the street with paper cups of coffee, the world continuing without knowing Daniel Carter had just defended his wife one last time in a probate courtroom. 2 weeks later, the trustees completed their initial review. Marks. Access to Carter Holdings' financial systems was suspended pending an internal audit. Margaret's attorney contacted Rebecca to arrange the return of my belongings from the house, but I did not move back in right away. I rented a small apartment 5 miles from downtown, with white walls, quiet neighbors, and a kitchen window that caught the afternoon sun. The first thing I unpacked was Daniel's photograph from Maine. The second was the cedar box. I placed both on a shelf where I could see them every morning. People later asked whether I was relieved to have control over the money. They never understood that the money had never been the wound. The wound was standing beside my husband's memory while his own family treated me like a stranger trying to steal from a house I had helped turn into a home. Daniel did not leave me power so I could punish them. He left me proof so I would never have to beg them to believe me. And in the end, the court did more than reveal who controlled the estate. It revealed who had loved Daniel quietly, who had used his name loudly, and who had been waiting for the money while accusing me of doing the same.